At Kina Mutual Group, we believe that a brighter financial future should be accessible to everyone. That's really important. Kina Mutual Group and its foundation has a long-standing history of investing in the community where we have a footprint. Every year, we're averaging at least 9,000, 10,000 volunteer hours that are reported and recorded. But each one of those community members always says to me, with the employees, with the leadership at Kina Mutual Group, you all authentically show up. The fact that you do support your employees, that shows that you are invested in the community. There is something so special about doing something as a collective whole where you have these shared experiences. It is worth it. Not was, it is worth it.
For her dreams policy from American Family Insurance. Insure carefully. Dream fearlessly.
Hi, I'm Kim Spanum, CEO and President of Summit Credit Union. We are so excited to sponsor another Madison 365 Women's Leadership Summit. Women's financial health is especially important to us at Summit Credit Union, and we've focused on it for more than a decade. Women are twice as likely as men to associate negative emotions with their finances, and it's no mystery why. Women still earn less than men for a variety of reasons. Women have less saved for retirement, and they're almost half as likely to invest in the stock market when compared to their male counterparts. But we're also seeing positive signs. There are more female entrepreneurs than ever before, and we know from experience that women with higher levels of financial literacy tend to save more, spend more wisely, and invest more than their peers. I encourage you to use this conference as an opportunity to improve your own financial literacy and find inspiration in the incredible women joining us today. Thank you for letting us be a part of your journey.
I will do that. Okay. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited about the conversation we're about to engage in. And, today I want to thank first and foremost Madison 365 for opening up this forum for women and powerful women to get together and have fruitful conversations about topics that traditionally can be tough. And I'm specifically excited about this topic on guns and gun violence and just kind of where we go from here. Because traditionally these topics are often being discussed by men and sometimes we're not at the table. So more power to all of us that showed up for this panel, but all of you that are also tuning in as well. And I know today we'll talk about a various amount of different topics, but I'd be remiss to say that, we want to acknowledge everyone who might be feeling a little heavy and heavy-hearted and heavy of the mind due to Roe v. Wade being overturned today. I think that has different implications that I'm sure we'll read about and maybe we'll even touch upon here today. But this is where representation matters, elections matter. So as we continue to move through this year, we have some upcoming elections here in Wisconsin, but also nationally next year. And so I encourage you to continue to exercise your right to vote and show up to those polls. So with that, I'll just quickly introduce myself and ask each of my panelists to take a few seconds to introduce themselves as well. Griselda Aldrete, community member, lifelong Milwaukeean, but also just an individual who cares deeply about the communities that we serve, both in our state, but also across the country and nationally and globally as well. And today, my opinions are of my own. And so I just want to make sure that we can have a great, respectful conversation with each other. With anyone who's willing to ask a question in the chat, we'll be monitoring those and hope to get to those by the end of this conversation. But first, I'd like to introduce our panelists as well. With me, I have Samantha Skenandore. She's an attorney in private practice. I have Blanca de León, a psychotherapist and counseling faculty at Madison College. And Diana Perez, an investigator at the Fire and Police Commission for the City of Milwaukee. And with that, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to share a little bit about you and what brought you to want to do this panel and why, topics like these are important. So Samantha, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Griselda. Good to meet everyone. Samantha Skenandore. I'm a Ho-Chunk Oneida from 2 tribes here in Wisconsin. I live in Madison, been here around 20 years total. And like Griselda said, I practice law, and I'm also an advocate, a lobbyist for tribes across the country. That means, I'm definitely not in Wisconsin much. I'm out in DC. I'm out on the ground on reservations, remote reservations all over. One of the things that brought me here is my commitment to women and the health of our Indigenous people. I know I've spent a great deal of my pro bono hours representing nearly 80 cases involving domestic violence, guns, all kinds of really bad stories that never make the news, but they're bad stories in and of themselves. And I hope that, chiming in on guns and violence and mental health today kind of reflects, what type of work we really do. We're the cleanup crews. We're the ones who get in the lanes and do the work after these things happen. So what we see, what we experience, how we heal, how we could have prevented things, this voice needs to be heard. That's why I'm here.
Great. Thank you. Diana?
Hi, my name is Diana Perez. As Griselda mentioned, I am an investigator with the City of Milwaukee Fire and Police Commission. That is my professional capacity. However, I just want to make sure I'm putting a disclaimer that all opinions that I give today are of my own, and I do not represent or speak for the Fire and Police Commission today. In my personal capacity, I am a wife and a mother of 3 children. The topic matters, because usually, as Griselda mentioned, when it's a discussion regarding gun violence or gun safety, men are the majority who are called upon for the feedback, and it's seldom that women are allowed or even included in that discussion. So thank you so much for this forum. But in fact, if we think about it, regardless of your race, your gender, your education, your social status, violence affects us all of us. Never in a million years would I have thought that a mass shooting would affect me directly until the Deer District mass shooting occurred on May 13th. My 2 oldest children were actually at the Deer District that night. And, I thought, wow, again, but this time it hit home. And, we can't sit by and just let these cycles continue and the violence to continue. It's time that we speak. And as soon as I received this invitation, I said, definitely, we have to do something. And I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Diana, for sharing that personal tie to this topic. And last but not least, my very good friend, Blanca de León.
Hi, everyone. My name is Blanca de León. I am born and raised in Wisconsin. I'm actually from rural Wisconsin. I work in Madison, but I actually live in Fond du Lac. But I am all over the state with some of the consulting work that I do for mental health for the immigration purposes and also for guardianships. I have been in the mental health field since 2006 officially. And it's been very interesting to watch the mental health system kind of evolve. I worked in it prior to Obamacare, then after Obamacare. And it's interesting, anytime there's violence with guns, the blame is put on mental health. And although mental health is a portion of that, right, it plays a role sometimes, it's not the scapegoat that it should be. And I think that when it is used inappropriately, it just amplifies the stigma of getting help, right? Because you're seen as violent or you're seen as someone that shouldn't have a gun or something like that. So I was really interested in coming to speak on that behalf and not put all the blame on mental health. And also, as a mother of 2 girls and, most recently with the Uvalde shooting where, I'm devastated every time that we have one, but kind of like Diana, I didn't have a personal connection, but it seemed a little more personal because I do have family in Texas. I do have family in San Antonio. And the faces of those children look like my nieces and nephews. And it's hard not to personalize that. And so this one has been incredibly difficult for me as a mother and just a community member. And like everyone else said, the comments, my opinions are mine today. They do not reflect Madison College.
I love it. Even though there's two attorneys here, all of us will act like attorneys today, right? All of our opinions are our own today. And to be able to just have a frank conversation. And I think that's why I was excited that each of you accepted the invitation to come, because one, you have an area of expertise in your day-to-day job, but two, I knew that we could have a good, honest dialogue, a raw dialogue in some cases, right? And sometimes voices that need to be amplified and heard. And so I thought we'd start, we'll have a free-flowing conversation for those of you watching and listening. But I think to start this conversation, we should level set the facts, right? And we tried to, all of us did our research, and I tried to look at statistics. And let me tell you, where to find accurate statistics in America is tough, because there's just a lot of websites, a lot of information out there. But I went to a couple of what I would consider credible, like the CDC, there's Gifford's gun laws. And then I have an actual map right now, and the data was published this morning. And so total number of gun violence related deaths is 20,993 in 2022 alone. That is almost 21,000 people that are no longer with us in the 6 months that this year has elapsed already. 9,443 of those are homicide, murder, or unintentional death, and 11,550 are of suicide. So, I think recently, right, we've been sort of hit with all of these mass shootings, right? And mass shootings to date, injuries have been 281, mass murders 14, children under the age of 11 that were killed 170 and injured 353. Number of teens ages 12 to 17 killed 626. Injured 1,639. So that's that level set, right? And as I was doing some more digging, 200 Americans are shot and injured on a daily basis in America today. That's 200, right? It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a lot. And when I was digging for data too, it surprised me because I was trying to do a breakdown of race, gender, right? And couldn't find it. What I could only find was the data is broken down by white, Black, and Hispanic. And Black Americans are at higher risk for homicides. But I was really trying to do the breakdown so that we could see, is it male to male, male to female, female to male, right? And that data is kind of skewed. So curious on this panel, what are your thoughts on those numbers alone? But also, where are we getting our information, or sort of what do these numbers mean? How do we contextualize what we're seeing in the media versus what we saw with Uvalde, right? And Uvalde kind of hit home for obvious reason, and Blanca, you kind of hit on it, right? But since Sandy Hook, and I know, Samantha, you have personal, research with Sandy Hook, but, how do we level set, and how do we take this data and absorb it in a way that actually means something to not only each of us, but those listening and to the wider audience?
Well, I want to just put a pin in this first off, because, the data is the data, but the data is not enough data, and it's not accurate data. Working in Indigenous communities, there's tribes all over this country that are not included in the data sets you're talking about. There's never really been a government accountability office assessment on gun violence in Indian country. There is no model codes for tribal government to deal with guns and gun violence in Indian country. A lot of times tribes, they have different political and governmental schemes with each of the states and with their federal relationship, because they have a federal tribal relationship. They are not willing or not able to share their data from their own reservations with the state or with the US DOJ, so that these numbers are really accurate and reflective. What we do know, when numbers do come out and when there is some slicing and dicing of these numbers, that Native Americans end up having the highest and worst impacts from gun violence overall, from suicides, and from domestic violence. We know we are categorically the winner across the board. So it's important to know that when you're looking at these statistics, they're not whole, and they aren't quite reflective of our BIPOC, our Indigenous, and our people of color communities.
And Deanna, what are you seeing this from your lens on the Fire and Police Commission, right? As you're looking at some of these, officer related deaths or kind of some of these traffic stops, or what kind of like that data as we're looking at, those numbers as well.
Well, when you look at the data, so, that was more of your data was more of on a national level, but you look in, Milwaukee, more on our level, and we've had, up to June 22nd, we had 102 homicides. 90% of those homicides were gun related. And then, it breaks down by age. So, for ages, there's 41% involved individuals between the ages of 18 and 29. 23% of those were the ages were 30 to 29. The gender, mostly male, 81% were male, 19% were female. 92% of them were African-American individuals, 3% were Hispanic, 3% white, 1% Asian, and then they had 1% for other. And then even more of a breakdown that is provided is 44% of those, there were actually charges were filed, whereas 56% charges were not yet filed on that. So you look at those numbers, and to me, right away, I just thought, we're killing our future. Our future is dying off. These are the individuals who are going to, who should be able to have families and create families, and they're gone. It's just not. It's probably one of the most saddest numbers when I was looking at that. But then also you think about the fatigue and the stress that it's causing on our law enforcement officials and our members, because we have a shortage of law enforcement officials. That's nationwide. It's not just a Milwaukee issue. It's a nationwide. So the fatigue on these officers and the fatigue on our healthcare system, where we are not really addressing the violence fiercely enough or tough enough. Where do we go for this? Where do we go? How do we make the changes? More programs. A lot of these shootings, a lot of the problems that happened, it's conflicts. So how do they resolve conflicts? Someone brings a weapon in. Maybe having more conflict resolution programs, whether it's in the schools, get to them early, get to these individuals when they're younger. Having more programs for the mental health issues that might come up, where it is a reality, individuals have mental health problems. However, that's not the only issue. We do just have people who make bad decisions and who don't know how to resolve the conflict. So that's really my view from this.
And Blanca, right? I saw you nod your head, right, when I said almost 12,000, right, of those deaths involve suicide, right, and by a weapon, and usually it's the gun, And I think your intro was spot on, right? I mean, we tend to see, right, mass shootings, right? Somebody else is kind of inflicting that type of injury to someone else, but there's a lot of individuals who inflict it on themselves, and not that we forget about it, right? But I think in the height of COVID, I think you and I've talked about this, right? Suicide rates have gone up. So can you talk a little bit about, that piece before we move on to like a little bit on more topics on this topic?
Absolutely. Actually, the state of Wisconsin, when you talk about where you get your information, and it's really hard to get accurate data, but the state of Wisconsin, and, I look at that information because this is where I live, and you want to impact change locally first before, you get at a national level. And some of the comments made about, our indigenous tribes, right? They have some of the highest suicide rates in Wisconsin. There was a study done from 2007, I believe, to 2014 or 15. And so it was over many years looking at the data. And there's another one coming out very soon, and I'd be very, very curious to look at that. But contrary to popular, belief, in the state of Wisconsin, our suicides primarily occur in our rural areas. And they're primarily white men or Native American males, and then, females and youth as well. And so surprisingly, in the cities, suicide rates are much less. And that it's twofold, right? It's access to guns as well as access to mental health. And in our rural areas and with our indigenous communities, the access to mental health can be sometimes non-existent in some areas. And now we have telehealth, which is great and it works wonderfully, but you need to have a reliable internet connection, which many of our tribes and people in our rural areas do not. So, there's those two parts of that, because Wisconsin is a rural state. And I forgot about your second question because, I tend to go on tangents here, but what was the second part of the question?
I mean, I think it was just, I saw you nodding your head, right? That, when I think about gun violence and how I wanted us to tackle the conversation, right? It's different facets, right? That it's not just mass shootings, right? There's death by suicide, homicide, right? And so, and who is sort of the mostly affected, but we don't even have that accurate data, right? So while we're seeing almost 21,000 people, there could be a lot of people that are unaccounted for, right? Because where are we getting our information from? And so, that leads me to another thought I had is, where are we getting our information from? And so I'd be curious from each of you, where do you get your information from, right? I mean, we obviously rely on the internet. There's media outlets, news agencies, social media, right? And if all of you know me, I have a love-hate relationship with social media. And mostly because, right, it could be down, it goes down slippery slopes, right? And who do we find reliable? And I think a lot of that is personal. I think about the attorney in me, where always wants to believe that, like, Department of Justice, right, is where we should be kind of getting our most reliable information in different offices. But whose responsibility is it to provide accurate information? Is it the people putting it out? Is it us to be self-informing ourselves and then helping to spread that message? So be curious from each of you, like, where do you get your information from? But also, like, who bears the responsibility of providing that accuracy as well? And anyone?
Well, I was going to say, I don't get mine from Fox News, but I actually do read and watch Fox News for a different purpose, though, because I am very curious as to what their listeners are hearing. I think that's important to know. I think it's important to know what, I don't know how many people tune into them, millions and millions are hearing, because it allows me to kind of fact check, look at where their sources are. And I believe in getting it from a variety of resources. So I do a lot of BBC. I will check CNN, although I know they tend to, lean left. NBC, CBS, I check them all out. I've become an old woman for sure because I'm constantly reading the news. And I like to also see what other countries say about us, because that's always a very, very interesting perspective. So, even our Spanish channels and our Mexico, our close country here. And I think, honestly, it's the responsibility of everyone. But once you try to hold them responsible, they say, well, people are free to inform themselves how they want. So I know personally, I really try hard to double check facts. I look at their sources, and that might be the educator in me. Let me see that study that they looked at. What does that actually say?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's important, right? What are other people saying about us, right? We tend to think, and it's still, some people will still say America is the melting pot, but I would have different conversations and like to challenge some of those thoughts. But I mean, I think, where people are watching us, globally, right? In some ways, and I have friends in Europe and Mexico and everywhere. And in some ways we seem to be regressing, and in others we are progressing, right? And so I love that you are constantly checking, and you're not old. It's just, we just try to be informed, right? And Samantha and Diana, thoughts on where we get our information from and who bears the responsibility of providing that accuracy?
Right. I have to say it's government responsibility. I don't, and if they can't do it, then they're going to have to outsource it. Like they can't, when they can't do anything, right? Go bring somebody in with the power to get it done. If it's a private person, probably women of color to get it done. Quite honestly, that's usually who gets things done at the end of the day. I'll just throw that in since it's my own opinion. But, one thing we've learned, you probably heard of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's, movement. And that is, calling a great deal of attention on women that go missing in all areas of Indian country across the United States. It includes, our other sisters of color who go missing as well, who once they go missing or they're not found, they're not looked for. We don't have the same resources as a non-Indigenous person does when they go missing. No stone is unturned. We'll find 9 more bodies looking for this one person, then we'll look for the 300 other people that are missing in the same region. It's really heart-wrenching to see that America seems not to care about people of color, and that's a resounding message we've been hearing since we were little girls ourselves, and we're now professional women working in these areas, helping in these larger fronts. We have to be honest and say, well, we need to change that. We need to go in aggressively and figure out why we're not getting the attention, why we're not getting the money we need to solve these problems, why we're not getting the coordination, why the governments aren't doing their job in keeping these statistics. And that includes tribal governments. I'll tell you, I represent a client who provides wraparound behavioral care to tribal youth. And, going to what Blanca said, a lot of these numbers that she's talking about right here in Wisconsin are Native youth committing suicide. And so this service provider goes into remote areas where, like Blanca said, they have no mental health services. A lot of the government services for mental health, they can't go into the home. They're restricted, right? They're limited to the forms of where they can provide services. They can't go into the parents. But private contractors can, guess what? And they can make differences and changes. This contractor on reservation thwarted teen suicide by 40% within 1 year of giving wraparound care to those Native kids on that reservation. And so it is effective. What Blanca is saying is actually effective, and it needs to be taken in consideration that to get that number, though, that tribe has to produce the statistics and say, yes, we've had 42 youth die this past year on our reservation, and we want it to be less than 10 next year. That's how the numbers work. And we need those numbers so that we can give that kind of care. You can't prescribe things without data. Doctors do not give you prescriptions without, medically licensed and well thought out plans for you. And so, we can't expect people to run with broken legs. We got to fix the leg to make this work. And I think, where do we get the sources? The government's, I think, one, it's the government's responsibility. 2, if they can't or won't do it, outsource it, just get it done. 3, then give it to the hands of people like women of color so we can get the work done and get those people out there and make the changes that need to be made.
I love that. Women making things happen.
Definitely. I read a lot from so many different websites, and so similar to like the data that I got that I was given earlier. I had that data from the Milwaukee Police Department, the crime statistics that are regularly updated, the CDC website, and the Medical College of Wisconsin here also has their own homicide dashboard that has an amazing breakdown as well for everything, for all the different ranges that I've provided. But I always read, but I verify. I verify, is this true? Did this really happen? Because you can have so many different points of views and perspectives. And on social media, it's all opinions. It's everyone's opinion. There's very few facts that are actually shared. Actually, this morning, when I was looking on Facebook, there was an article that someone shared, or like a meme that someone shared. It was this is our future. You have a diesel-powered pickup hauling over like a charger to charge an electric powered electric vehicle, and then right below it you have like 4 fact checks that Facebook automatically added. And I'm just thinking, why aren't they doing this for all articles, for all of these different opinions that people share? Why aren't we fact checking all of it? You can't pick and choose what you want to censor, what you want to look a little bit further into. So, in my social circles, I'm the old lady, because I'm always like, hey, did you read that article? Did you know that this is going on? And they're like, what do you mean? I sent you the link. Griselda, you and I, we're always sending each other information. It's like, oh my goodness. So, you read, but you verify. And I definitely agree the government definitely needs to step in a little bit better to make sure that the information that's going out there is correct information, because our young people are reading this too. And we want to make sure that the information they have is correct.
So, Diana, that takes me to 2 points, right? Is the role of social media, right? Who we follow, what we follow, right? There's influencers now, right? That kind of can influence not only what you wear, what you buy, but what you think, right? But then also, right, Samantha, you said it's the role of the government, but it's twofold. Do people trust the government and who's running these offices, right? That's the dichotomy here, is we're holding these entities responsible to help us make better decisions, right, as citizens of this country. But it's, is there a way, what's the balance, right? I mean, I think Congress tried to enforce on Facebook, right, that, they should be accurately reporting, making sure they're not falling into politics, right? Because that's not the role of them. But I don't know if that worked. Right now, Elon Musk is bought Twitter, or is in the fight to buy Twitter. I'm trying to keep up, but I can't, right? But you have one person kind of buying a huge social media platform where people tune in every day to get their news and their information. And, who are we following, right? And how do we avoid extremism? Because obviously we've seen what extremism can look like. And now, right, January 6th, right, we're still listening to testimony and uncovering data about what actually happened that day. And, and so I for you, help me understand, right? What is the role of social media, since I have a love-hate relationship with it, right? But what is that role? And, who gets to control it, right? And how do we control it? Because I feel like now that's the way we do communicate. And where people get information. So curious on your thoughts on that from anyone on this panel.
Yeah, if I could pipe in, I take great beef with social media. It is, it's so many good things and it's so many bad things. And just for giggles, before the panel, I was looking up some of the wealthiest people in the world. And, you talk about Elon Musk and you talk about Bezos, and you look at what they're making. They have every interest in the world to keep these platforms growing, getting more extreme, because the more extreme their platforms get, the more money they make. And, the wealth of this country is all around social media. So we are dealing with the biggest, lion, the biggest elephant in the room you could ever think of right now. And unfortunately, what goes to heck when it comes to that reality is that data and messages and influencers are taking over our entire country. They're taking over our messaging. They're taking over how our children think. You can teach them all you want in school, but at the end of the day, they're going to show you a TikTok video, or they're going to show you a YouTube video. They're going to tell you why you should think this in a different way. And it's better because it's prettier, it's funnier, it's more relatable to them. And that's what's sinking in their long-term memory of how they're going to be problem solving down the road. I have kids myself, so I see them more from, studious academic kids from school into social media students as well. And it's pretty scary. But what I think is most scary is that there are, again, like you said, Griselda, these influencers, these are people that are not qualified, in my opinion. And again, I'm harsh here, to be saying things that they're saying. They are not experts. They're not licensed people like you and I. They don't have degrees to back up what they're saying. They don't have experiences. They don't have any of that stuff. They're just common folks talking about very critical issues in our world, mental health, gun violence, domestic violence, suicide. And they are making these enormous claims and setting forth these thought processes to a very vulnerable population who spends most of their time, watching social media because it's fast, it's quick. They can switch platforms as quick as they got the 3 or 4 platforms. It's boom, boom, boom in a matter of 5 minutes. And they can cover this from those different ways. And what they're not doing, they're not reading, the SCOTUS blog, or they're not reading, statistics that we, again, can barely find ourselves. They are not being taught by professionals, licensed people that really know the subject matter. These are not subject matter experts, but they're influencing entire generations in different ways that we are now having to deal with and reconcile with these decisions. And so one of the things, again, is the outcome of extremism on, pro-gun, anti-gun, and they want to keep us apart. And they've been doing a really, really good job, clearly, because we don't have a resolution yet. I know we're going to talk about, what the Senate just passed, but, it's really, that's the game. They have to keep us as far apart from each other as possible so we can actually work out the kinks together. And people just get tired of that. So they kind of, they tire of their own political systems. They tire of democracy as a whole. And then we get the January 6th thing happening, right? And we're listening to all the thought processes now as that's all unfolding as well. I guess we'll learn where that comes from. But I am very concerned about social influencers. We've got a lot in Indian country now. They are now taking the place of tribal leaders. I mean, they're literally meeting with governors, cabinet members, agencies, committee hearing folks, and they are not representative of tribal leadership. They are just somebody who may be Native or be close to a Native community, and Native leaders are following them. Congress is following them. Decision makers are following them. I'm probably following them just to see what they're saying, because they're getting the stage. They got the platform. People are giving them the platform. So we do have to address the social media front on any issue we're talking about. Let's all be real and call it for what it is.
Definitely.
I agree 100% with what you just said, by the way. And as I hear you and Diana speaking, I think Seth Rogen, right? Not an expert in vaccines, not an expert in mental health, not an expert in anything, but his word is golden to his followers, and we're talking about millions of people. And as a therapist, right, I look at this as like, wow, what I've learned, I think, since the Trump presidency is people really are always looking for someone to believe in. They almost make these people like deities or something, when they're just normal human beings. No one here is a deity. And it is scary, because it's like, wow, you're going to believe, you're choosing to believe Seth Rogen, who's got no background in vaccines or no background in said topic, over someone who has dedicated 35 years of their life to the topic. And it's like, where's the logic? For me, that's what social media is. I'm not on Facebook. Griselda knows this. I just learned how to post a story to Instagram. Griselda taught me how to do that. So I stay away from it because I get annoyed by all that. Watching this, I'm just like, what am I feel like I'm in the Twilight Zone. How are people like, yeah, I know you're right. Well, like, where did you study this? You didn't. You read an article once, 5 years ago. And so, I do see the dangers in it. I use it more for like entertainment, quite honestly. I watch TikToks to laugh, not to get information. And that's kind of what I try to tell my students, like at the college level, right? Like, this is more for entertainment. Let's remember that. Let's get our research, our information from trusted sources or actual research articles, and what that actually means, right? That there's a control group, that it's done multiple times in multiple places, and not to take the word of what you see. Not that you can't get good information, but you can't take the word for what you see for face value.
Yes, I completely agree with you both. Social media influencers, if you think about it, really, the bottom line is money. A lot of them make a lot of money, and they make a lot of money also for the different organizations and companies that sponsor them. So that's really what drives it. It's the money. I'm very careful who I follow on social media. I don't even think I've hit 25 that I follow on Twitter, Instagram, mainly family and whatnot. But, there are some that I will follow for influencing for, the health, for fitness and whatnot. It's always good to kind of see different points of view. And I too look at TikTok, but it's all for entertainment. When I'm in bed and it's kind of hard to sleep, and I'll just keep looking at videos, and next thing you know, it's 2 hours went by and I'm just looking at some TikTok dances, so that I definitely will follow for, just for the entertainment value, but definitely not for any factual information. And I always stress that as well with my kids. But if we think about it, some of these TikTok videos or some of the TikTok information that's being passed, it's in small little increments, like 5 minutes, 4 minutes. And that avenue. They have the platform that they can really give good information. We just have to find influencers or individuals who actually want to give the information that's important to get out there, and that is actually going to educate the individuals who are using the platforms. So it's just a matter of finding those influencers. I mean, Griselda, what do you think? You want to start that?
No. But no, I mean, I hear all of you, and I would agree, right? It's everybody's different, right? And it also is people's bandwidth too, right? I think, if you look at articles, when you read them, they'll be like 2-minute read, right? Because people's also bandwidth and attention spans have shortened too. So I think that's why these social media platforms, TikTok, Instagram, all of these that are coming out are trying to disseminate as fast, as quickly as they can, and as easy for people to digest, right? And we're humans. Some of us are more visual than others, right? And it's like reading is like a dying art now, right? Like, I mean, I still love reading a book, right? But people are reading on their iPads and Kindles, and I'm like, I can't do it. My eyes just can't do it. But it's because you're trying to change and keep up with the technology in the world today. And shifting gears, because we kind of are starting to kind of get to that more on the politics side, right? But like, do people really understand what these bills actually mean? What is happening? And, and right, on Tuesday, there was a bipartisan gun control bill kind of passed, right? And I have a question from the audience that, it says, will the bill recently passed in the U.S. Senate actually do any good? But before we even answer that question, like, do people really understand what this bill is intended to do, right? And Samantha, you want to chime in on this one, because I know, you and I could probably kind of dissect it as best we can. But do people really understand what the Senate is trying to do, right? And is it? I've also asked the question, like, is this reactive, right, based on Buffalo, right, Uvalde, and things that we started to see in California, and will it really address some of the hate crimes that come along with some of this gun violence that is happening?
Right. No, that's exactly it. I put in the chat for folks the everytown.org. My law firm was one of those law firms that stepped up to the pro bono call of duty to help with the Sandy Hook litigation. And if people remember when Sandy Hook took place, again to the conversation we had earlier, do we have a personal cross? Do we cross paths with people that are affected firsthand in these pieces of, or these events of violence? And we are all connected in 2, 3 at most degrees of separation. So you probably are. You probably just need to look for it because it's probably there. So trying to remove yourself from these incidences is probably not likely if you're being cold and honest with yourself. Number one, and two, well, what are we doing about it? In Sandy Hook, there was a group of people that even tried to legally say that Sandy Hook never happened. It was all like this fake, factoid thing that never actually took place. These children didn't actually die at the hands of gun violence. And so our law firm worked, in that area. And there is a small handful, again, that extremism is there. And going back to the necessary part of the conversation about social media and influencers, I want to just finish up with that to say, where do we go from there is like Diana said, we need to be in the game. You're not going to stop that train ever. You got to get on. We've got to have, like Drunk History. Have you ever watched Drunk History? Fantastic. It's like Hamilton time on steroids, great drunk histories out there on different topics. Go check them out. And we need influencers that I love the fact checkers, even on TikTok or Instagram. The fact checkers pop up all the time. There are righteous people that are pulling facts together and analyzing that. But that leads us into the question of the day on the chat is this bill going to actually do something positive or not? Well, it can if we safety net that bill, right? It can go out there and we can be pulled apart. Or we can create that safety net and really just bring this group, this bipartisan. It's meant to be bipartisan. It's strangely not as even as we'd like it to be. 15 to 50 is not definitely. I don't know how it's a very low level bipartisan effort. When it comes down to numbers, but I think it's important to go to this website everytown.org. This is something folks that are involved in mass shootings are looking at gun violence. This is kind of one of the staple places for great resources. We talked earlier about statistics, and there are crazy statistics out there that are not good. 24,000 people a year die from suicide. Most of the gun violence is actually by suicide, as we were talking about earlier. 6 out of 10 are by gun. And to the conversation earlier, if a person is suicidal and they have access to a gun, they're probably going to use it. And so we talk about gun violence and guns in the home. If there's a gun in the home, more than likely in these rural areas, and then we think about tribes, hunting and fishing. Tribes have been governing themselves for thousands of years. It wasn't until the speck of colonialism do we have, gun laws and gun problems. But, tribes have hunting and fishing and other treaty rights on their own lands. And, hunting and fishing involves weaponry, right? It's for subsistence. And there's a mass movement for food sovereignty coming back. And this is going to be a topic that's going to emerge in food sovereignty initiatives for tribes. And it's all related to just plain living, subsistence, right? So we look at this bill and we look at the bipartisan support, and, it could wane. It often does, right? Before these things even hit the ground, things can go south really quick. And now that we have, again, this SCOTUS ruling overturning Roe v. Wade, I haven't fully looked at all of the language in there to really get a clear picture on the dynamics of this court. And I will, mind you, I absolutely will, and I will chime in at some point. But it really does. The 6-3 number tells us that that's what we're looking at in terms of how the dynamics are working right now on the hottest issues of the day. And we have to pay attention to that number, without getting into, big, SCOTUS internal analysis. We can say that, this is how this court is working right now. And this bill is coming up here. If it passes, what always happens, there are cases out there that they are already queuing up to challenge the constitutionality out of anything that's going to come out and get signed into law. So they're already brewing, the best case and the set of facts to challenge constitutionality. You can bet your life that that's happening right now as this bill is cooking. So, how do we get there? We have to influence, people to come together. The provisions that are in it now, there's things that you hear about all the time: enhancing background checks, right? Supporting state red flag laws, disarming domestic abusers. That's the big one. Whenever you see a shooting and you hear a woman got shot, my mind instantly says domestic violence, probably in check here. We just had a shooting at the Oneida Casino here in Wisconsin. It was a female employee, domestic violence case, right? There we go again. It's happening here in Wisconsin, making national news. Disarming domestic abusers, at least in Wisconsin, when you get a DV order, you have to surrender your firearms for 4 years. That's not the case everywhere else, right? Sometimes they get to hold on to those. And then we have gun violence, right? We also look at, these straw statutes. So like, can Griselda go buy me a gun if I have a DV order against me? I can't have a gun. Can she go get me a gun and hand it over to me? And I could do what I want to do with that gun. There's straw people that are used to go and buy and access this weaponry. And then there's a bunch of other things that I think a lot of people have been trying to, force into the legislation, which is like mental health screening, access, services, school safety funding, community violence intervention, things we've been asking for. A part of this whole, BLM, defund the police. Let's put the money in these restorative type of programs that it can give us some healing, give us some help in that regard. And I know that's all still in movement as well. We won't know numbers around BLM for 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But, not doing anything is also giving us a terrible number and a terrible direction. So I think we're all at that phase where, this bill is as ripe as it's ever been. It's got some support more than it ever has. It's very promising to people that want some action and response and more, focus and support in that area. I think, and not to be, grim about it. I mean, these assault weapons, seriously, these assault weapons. If you look at the bodies that are coming out of the use of these assault weapons, that's what we're talking about. Suicide is another bit, but the mass shootings and using these assault weaponry and reading about, how these bodies are coming out. This is not, I'm shooting you once in the leg like you see on TV. It is complete decapitation. It's really entire arm is missing. It's things that, can usually not be healed. So it's a very serious issue.
Well, and I'm looking at the time and we have about 10 minutes left, right? But I think, the other piece is I think when people hear bills and laws, I think they automatically think you're infringing on my freedom, right? You're infringing on what America is supposed to be, right? The land of the free. And, we had a joke earlier, right? Like, do people really understand the Bill of Rights and their real rights, right? Like the right to bear arms, like what does that really mean? Or free speech, right? Because it all ties into the social media movement. And I think that's the disconnect, right? I think when people are watching Congress pass these bills or these laws or overturn, right, a landmark case, it feels on both sides like there's infringement, right, on our personal rights and an ability to control our own bodies and our own actions. And so, but I think, to your point, Samantha, right, it's the access to the weaponry. We're not talking about small weapons. You're talking about, rifles, things that traditionally have been used in war, right, but your access as a 17, 18-year-old, right? And I think that was one of the most, I remember reading this statistic, right, specifically after the Texas shooting that, and it's true, right? How is it more accessible for you to buy a gun than rent a car or drink at 21? But yet, and are we really doing our fact checking? And so with the time that we have left, I'd like to just each one of you share, where do we go from here, right? We've obviously tackled a very difficult conversation in, 50 minutes or less now, right? And I think for all of the people listening, this isn't meant to be a right or a left conversation. It really is to have a dialogue. And what I'll say is, can we even get to a place where we can have these conversations in a professional, respectful way? Long are the days, I feel like, even in politics, right? Republicans and Democrats could sit in a room and debate appropriately, as opposed to, kind of where we are today, where people are just unwilling to have those hard conversations to come to a solution it's not going to be a perfect solution, but that'll actually look at how do we fix longstanding systemic issues in our world, right? And it could be from education, right, housing, and politics. So with the time we have left, where do we go from here? Not just specifically with firearm control, because this bill is a bill, right, but doesn't necessarily sit in your house every day, and you don't think about the Bill of Rights, right, every day as you're making decision. But who should we be talking to, and how do we protect one another, and how do we move from here? And so, Blanca, I'll start with you, right?
Well, I think, to answer some of that question too, when I first saw the bill, and I haven't read it in its entirety, but I was very, very disappointed. Okay. And I think during these times, it's incredibly easy to get disappointed and despondent and lose hope. And that's where I won't. I refuse to lose hope, right? Because I think of my 86-year-old mother who grew up during the Jim Crow era, who had to use, a different bathroom. And if she would have given up hope, what would have happened? I'm not giving up hope because I refuse to do that for my daughters and the future generations. The pendulum swings back and forth, and I'm going to be here for when it swings the other way. And the only thing that I can do at this point, and I encourage, my daughter to do, is, show up during the elections, your local elections, your county elections. Those matter. I'm showing up in November. Those are the things that I have, I guess, control over, right? And I think that just, reflecting on the past and always knowing that, okay, someone had it worse, right? And they persevered. I'm not giving up, and I'm holding on and clinging on to that hope, regardless of what happens, because clearly Roe versus Wade was not forever. And what we have right now will not stay forever either. We are underestimated in small numbers, I think, and those small numbers, when they gather, our grassroots efforts can really accomplish quite a bit. And that's where I'll leave that, is, keeping on with my hope.
Beautifully said, Blanca. Diana.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. The bill, it's not perfect by any means, but at least the needle's moving. It's moving in a direction. At least, it's a bipartisan bill that there was some type of agreements that were made. But what was concerning to me is the federal law. The age is 18 to purchase an assault weapon. 18. I think of how I was, my mental state, or even how how mature I was at the age of 18 to be able to own something that will destroy a body. Why does an 18-year-old need an assault weapon? I don't understand that. That I definitely think is something that should be added to the bill, is raising the age from 18 to at least 21, same as with handguns. There's no need for an 18-year-old to have that assault weapon. But I also think we need to start looking at fundings for programs. We have to be more present in day-to-day lives of different individuals in our lives. Like, you think when I was reading an article about the Uvalde shooter, his grandfather said, we didn't talk. We never had any conversations. We never really interacted. That is a problem. That is a problem. There were red flags all over the place with that. You're not talking to a teenager that's living in your house. That is when you have to get to them, is when they are teenagers, when they are starting to form their own opinions, starting to mature into adults that you're going to send out into the world. We also have to be present when it comes to elections, motivate each other. I read about it all the time when it's election time, that people, especially on social media, oh, my vote doesn't matter, my voice doesn't matter, but it does matter. It does. And we have to make sure that we're motivating each other to get out there and vote, to make our voices heard. And also programs for conflict resolution, because a lot of this violence occurs because of conflicts that we don't know how to maturely agree to disagree anymore. And those are my thoughts when I think of where do we go from here. We need programs that are actually going to help us come together as a community, because if we don't, the future is grim.
Thank you, Diana. Samantha.
Thanks. This is always the topic of this house, like every day is, I tell my kids, learn the game and play the game. It's all a game. You don't set the game up. You're just a player on the board. What's the game? What are you expected to do? What is it that you can do? How do you get in front of everything? It's just a game. And, in this case, if this is a bill, this is legislation, this is how bills go forward is, you get, people behind the bill, right? You call your representatives. I know that sounds lame and old, but it helps. There's numbers that come out of that office that they have to track. And it's hard for people that, that don't agree with you, that have numbers coming in their district that say otherwise, right? It's hard for them to reconcile what they have to do in representative functions. So play the game, talk to your representatives, have a regular relationship with them, talk to your political action committees that, you think are actually moving and doing things, and be picky with your time. There's not enough time in the world and energy to cover all your bases, but there are causes and movements out there that are, just like I said at this everytown.org, quick, concise, easy to understand data and movements and around gun violence. I thought it was, really well laid out. I think they do a fantastic job, for example, on this topic, but, vote, teach people to vote, teach kids to engage beyond social media. Again, be part of their social media. This is a really annoying thing. I hate doing this myself, but see what they're look at what they're looking at. Watch what they're doing. Check out what videos they liked, which ones they saved, which ones they shared. What is influencing your kid? That's your responsibility, and it's not a parental responsibility from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or even the 80s. But it is our responsibility as parents today to know what our kids are doing, what they're diving into, what they're hearing, and shaping them, with that. One of the things I started doing recently is getting my kid off media and putting them in youth summits and leadership summits, getting them engaged with people like them in person again. And while there's always a social media piece in that avenue as well, they're doing it, in combination, and they're reconciling real life human beings and thoughts along with what they're doing. So raising the next generation in a healthy way as much as possible and keeping track of each other, I think that's really important, but play the game, just play the game.
I want to thank each and every one of you for your thoughts, your wisdom, your time, talent, and treasure, and I'll just probably close by saying that, it's been an honor to share this platform with you. Kudos to Madison 365 for continuing to provide, I would say, accurate content, relevant content, not only for these summits, but year round. I think reporters and media outlets share that responsibility of education along with parents. But one of the things I'd also want to say is something Diana addressed early on is, when we're looking at gun and gun violence and the response, right? Public safety is at the core, right? Of something we all want, right? You want to go to work and come back home safely. You want your children to come home safely. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't take the time to also thank the people, first responders, law enforcement, right? I think they do get a lot of scrutiny. And I think after the Uvalde shooting, right, and the videos that come out and the information, right, that has come out on their response and or lack of response, we can't forget that they're humans too, dealing with trauma and traumatic events. And so I think sometimes, we like to pinpoint, right, because it's easier to point the finger. And that's why the social media, it drives me a little crazy because all of us are hiding behind the screen, pinpointing and kind of judging, right, as opposed to putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And so, let's be kind to one another, respect one another, but also continue to encourage this next generation to get involved. I love seeing people protesting in Madison, in Washington right now, getting involved. I think COVID changed the game of how we get involved, right? But I think there's also power in being able to set up a Zoom meeting, educate people, reach different audiences, but also looking at what professions we're encouraging this next generation to go into. We need more people in public office. We need the right people in public office because we need to vote for you. We need more women to stop being demonized for wanting to take on positions of leadership and power. But we need to support one another as women and women of color in our BIPOC communities. But also just figuring out how we can change this next generation. I know people say, right, Samantha, there's enough lawyers in the world, but I'm like, you can never have enough good lawyers fighting the good fight. And helping our communities thrive and shine. So to all of you listening, thank you for taking the time to listen to us. Thank you for continuing to support Madison 365. Samantha, Diana, and Blanca, thank you so much. Henry, Stephanie, and team, thank you for putting this together. And until next time, I'm wishing you all safe, healthy, blessed day.
This is 365 Media.